There is a moment most men never talk about it, where you are standing somewhere you shouldn't be, seeing something you weren't supposed to see, and every single cell in your body is telling you to run, not to call for help, not to say a word, just run. Harold Briggs had that moment on a cold November night in 1983, and he ran. He got in his truck, he drove home to his wife and his little boy, and he never said a single word about what he saw. Not to a neighbor, not to a pastor, not to a police officer, not even to his son Danny, who grew up watching his father carry something heavy that had no name. Harold Briggs died at 71 years old, with that secret still locked inside him. But he made one decision before he went, one quiet, careful, deliberate decision that would change everything his son thought he knew about the man who raised him. Because under the floorboards of an old garage in Clarksville, Tennessee, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with a padlock that had rusted nearly shut, Harold Briggs left something behind. 4 handwritten pages. A photograph, a name, and a phone number. And when Danny Briggs finally pried that box open on a gray Tuesday afternoon in October 2019, sitting alone in the garage where his father used to fix lawnmowers and listen to the radio on Sunday mornings, the life he thought he understood collapsed around him like a building with no foundation. The man he loved. The man he admired. The man he thought he knew every quiet corner of had been living inside a story his son was never allowed to read, until now. Before we go any further, I need you to sit with 3 questions. Because this entire story lives inside them. The first question is this: what does a man do when he witnesses something that could send powerful people to prison, and the only guarantee he has is that his silence keeps his family safe? The second question is this: if a man carries a secret for 40 years and then writes it all down before he dies, is that confession, or is that cowardice running out of time? And the third question, the one that Danny Briggs still can't fully answer, is this: was Harold Briggs protecting his family when he stayed quiet, or was he protecting himself? Because by the time this story ends, you are going to have to decide which of those 2 things is true, and it is not going to be easy. What happened on the 14th of November, 1983, in a processing plant outside Clarksville, Tennessee, involved a man who went to work one evening and never came home. It involved a plant manager with connections to people in this state who had no interest in justice. It involved a payoff so quiet and so carefully handled that Harold Briggs almost convinced himself it hadn't happened. Almost. The story you are about to hear is real. The events are documented. The names have been changed. And somewhere in the middle of all of it is a father and a son, and a locked metal box, and 40 years of silence that nearly buried the truth forever. Before we go any deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you have not already, please hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. We put out a new one every single week, and trust me, you do not want to miss what is coming. To understand what Harold Briggs did and why he did it, you have to understand the world he came from. Harold Eugene Briggs was born in 1,948 inches, a small town called Harlan in southeastern Kentucky coal country, where the hills roll green in summer and bitter cold in winter, and where the men who live there tend to carry their lives the same way they carry heavy things, quietly, without complaint, and without asking for help. His father worked the mines. His grandfather worked the mines. Harold broke that chain when he was 19 years old and took a bus north to Bowling Green, then west to Nashville, eventually landing in Clarksville, Tennessee in 1971, where he found work at a lumber processing plant called Meridian Industrial on the outskirts of town. He was 23 years old. He had $12 in his wallet and a pair of work boots that were already 2 sizes too worn. Harold was not a complicated man, at least not on the surface. He worked hard, he was punctual, he never missed a shift in 27 years at Meridian. His supervisors described him in performance reviews, which Danny found in a filing cabinet after the funeral, as reliable, thorough, and unobtrusive. That last word is important. Unobtrusive. It means he didn't push, didn't complain, didn't ask for more than he felt he'd earned. He was the kind of man who fixed things quietly, who showed up early, who went home on time, and who kept his thoughts mostly to himself. In 1974, he married a woman named Carol Ann Weaver, a school teacher from Springfield, Tennessee, who was the opposite of Harold in almost every way: warm where he was reserved, talkative where he was silent, certain where he was careful. Carol would later tell her sister that she fell in love with Harold because he made her feel safe. There was something about him, she said, that made you believe nothing bad could touch you when he was nearby. He was steady, immovable, the kind of man who doesn't flinch. In 1977, their son Danny was born Daniel Ray Briggs, a bright, energetic kid who grew up watching his father the way boys do when they admire someone without knowing how to say it. Danny played Little League. He mowed the lawn without being asked. He got decent grades and worked a part-time job at a hardware store in high school. He was, by every account, a good kid being raised by a good family in a good neighborhood in a mid-sized Tennessee city. From the outside, nothing about the Briggs family looked complicated. But Danny would tell you later that there were signs, things he noticed growing up that he filed away as just the quirks of a quiet man. Harold never talked about his work beyond the basic facts of it. He never socialized with his coworkers outside of the occasional company picnic. He had a habit, Danny remembered, of stopping whatever he was doing and going still, genuinely still. The way a man goes still when he's listening for something that isn't there anymore, and then snapping back into the present moment like he'd caught himself somewhere he shouldn't be. There was one specific memory Danny carried for years. He was 11 years old. He walked into the garage late at night to get a glass of water from the old mini-fridge his father kept out there, and he found Harold sitting at his workbench with a piece of paper in his hand. Harold heard the door and shoved the paper into the top drawer of the workbench so fast that the drawer rattled. He looked at Danny and said, very calmly, "Go back to bed, son." And Danny went back to bed. And he never asked about it, because Harold Briggs was not the kind of father you asked about things like that. You just trusted that he had his reasons. It is worth pausing here to understand what Meridian Industrial was in 1983, because context matters enormously in this story. The plant processed raw timber cutting, drying, treating, and packaging lumber for commercial distribution across the Southeast. It employed around 240 people at its peak, most of them working-class men from Montgomery County and the surrounding area. By the early 1980s, the plant had developed a reputation quiet, the kind of reputation that lives in break rooms and parking lots, not in newspapers for cutting corners on safety. There had been 2 serious equipment accidents in 1981. A man lost 2 fingers on a saw belt that should have had a safety guard replaced 6 months earlier. Another man suffered chemical burns on his hands and forearms from exposure to wood treatment compounds that, according to OSHA standards at the time, required protective gear that was not being provided consistently. Both incidents were filed. Both were settled quietly. And the plant continued operating. Warrendale Cross had been the general manager of Meridian Industrial since 1979. He was 44 years old in 1983. A thick-shouldered man with a firm handshake and a reputation in Clarksville as someone who got things done. He sat on the board of the local Chamber of Commerce. He was a deacon at First Baptist. He coached his son's youth baseball team on Saturday mornings. He was, by every visible measure, a pillar of the community. He was also, according to Harold's 4 handwritten pages, a man who was willing to do things in a locked office late at night that he would never do in daylight. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Because before we talk about what Harold saw, we need to talk about the man he saw it happen to. Philip Allen Rudd was 38 years old in November of 1983. He worked as a field inspector for the Tennessee Department of Labor and Workforce Development, assigned to the Regional Safety Audit Division. His job was to walk into facilities like Meridian Industrial, review records, examine equipment, interview workers, and determine whether the plant was in compliance with state and federal workplace safety regulations. He had been doing that job for 11 years and, by most accounts from colleagues who would later speak to investigators, he was thorough, methodical. The kind of inspector who didn't accept the first answer he was given. Philip Rudd had a wife named Beverly and 2 kids, a boy named Marcus, who was 12, and a daughter named Ruth, who was 9. He had a small house in Hendersonville, Tennessee. He drove a brown 1981 Ford pickup. He liked fishing and was a decent amateur woodworker. He was, in every ordinary sense, an ordinary man doing an important job in a way that made powerful people uncomfortable. And in the first 2 weeks of November 1983, Philip Rudd was conducting an audit of Meridian Industrial that was, by all indications, not going well for Warren Cross. The 14th of November 1983 was a Monday. It was cold. A front had come through the weekend before and brought the temperature down into the low 30s in Clarksville. Harold Briggs was not supposed to be at the plant that night. He had already put in his regular shift, 8 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon, and had gone home for dinner. But around 8 o'clock that evening, his supervisor called the house and asked if Harold could come back in for a couple of hours. There was a pressure issue in the east storage wing, a maintenance problem that had been flagged earlier that afternoon. Harold was one of 2 maintenance workers trusted to handle the older equipment in that section of the plant. The other man, a guy named Roy Stacker, wasn't answering his phone. So Harold kissed Carol on the cheek, told Danny he'd be back before 10, and drove back to the plant in the dark. He arrived around 8:40. He signed in with the night security desk, a formality at Meridian, and made his way to the east storage wing. The plant was mostly empty at that hour, a skeleton crew at most. Harold later wrote in his handwritten account that the building had that particular kind of quiet that old industrial facilities get after hours, when the machinery is off and all you can hear is the building itself settling and the wind finding cracks in the walls. He was working on a pressure valve assembly near the back of the east wing when he heard voices coming from the direction of the supervisor's office, a room set into the far wall of the building, accessible from the main floor by a short interior corridor. The voices were elevated, not shouting, exactly, but raised. The kind of voices men use when they are past the point of pretending everything is fine. Harold described in his account that his first instinct was to stay where he was. He wrote, and I am paraphrasing his handwriting here because the spelling and grammar were not always clean, that he told himself it was none of his business, that managers had arguments sometimes, that he should finish his work and go home. But then the voices got louder, and then one of them stopped, just stopped, like someone had turned off a switch. And Harold Briggs, who was not a curious man by nature, set down his wrench and walked toward the corridor. He did not knock on the door. He did not call out. He walked quietly, the way a man walks when he already knows on some level that he is not going to like what he finds, and he stopped at the edge of the doorway. The door was open maybe 4 inches, enough to see. What Harold saw inside that office, as documented in his own handwriting 36 years later, was this. Warren Cross was standing near the far wall, his back partially turned. On the floor in front of the desk was a man Harold had seen around the plant for the past 2 weeks. The auditor, Philip Rudd, lying on his side. Rudd was not moving. His face was turned away. There was a second man Harold did not recognize, standing near the window heavyset, dark jacket, watching the door. A third man was on the telephone at the desk. Harold could not hear what he was saying. Warren Cross turned slightly, and Harold pulled back from the doorway. He stood in the corridor for what he described as maybe 10 seconds, maybe 15. He could not be sure. And then he walked back the way he came, went out through the east wing exit, crossed the parking lot to his truck, and drove away. He did not call 911 from the parking lot. He did not call from a payphone down the road. He drove home, parked in the driveway, sat in the truck for what he described as a long time, and then went inside and told Carol he had finished the job early and had a headache. Danny was already in bed. Harold sat in the living room with the television on and, by his own account, did not actually see or hear anything that was playing. He just sat there. He sat there until Carol came and told him it was time to come to bed, and he went. And the next morning he got up, had his coffee and biscuits, and drove back to the plant for his regular shift like nothing had happened. 3 days later, on Thursday, November 17th, Philip Rudd did not come home. His wife Beverly called his office. They told her he had left the Meridian site on Monday afternoon, and they hadn't heard from him since. Beverly filed a missing persons report with the Hendersonville police on Friday the 18th. The story made the Clarksville Leaf Chronicle in a small item on page 7 of the local section. Labor inspector missing, last seen in Montgomery County. There was a phone number. There was a brief physical description. There were no leads. The item ran once and then disappeared, the way small stories do when powerful people want them to. Harold Briggs read that article at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning while Carol made eggs. He read it twice. He folded the newspaper. He set it down next to his coffee cup, and he said nothing. He clipped the article later that day and put it in the top drawer of his workbench in the garage, the same drawer where Danny had seen him shove a piece of paper years earlier. He kept that clipping for the rest of his life. It was in the box. The following month, December of 1983, Warren Dale Cross was promoted to regional director for the parent company that owned Meridian Industrial, a timber conglomerate based in Memphis called Holloway Timber Group. It was a significant promotion. It came with a salary increase, a company vehicle, and an office in downtown Memphis. The announcement ran in the Clarksville paper with a photograph of Cross shaking hands with a Holloway executive. Harold Briggs read that article too. He did not clip it. He did not save it. But he did not forget it either. In January of 1984, Harold received a pay raise of 11%, well above the standard annual adjustment for his position, which had historically been between 2 and 3%. He did not ask why. His supervisor, a man named Gene Pruitt, brought him the paperwork, told him he'd been recognized for his performance and reliability, and wished him a happy new year. Harold signed the form. He drove home. He did not tell Carol about the raise for 3 weeks. This is the moment in Harold's story where everything becomes complicated, because what Harold did next, or rather what he did not do, is the thing that Danny Briggs has spent years trying to understand. Harold Briggs took that raise. He kept going to work. He kept his head down. He was, by every observable measure, the same quiet, reliable, unobtrusive man he had always been. But inside the house on Millbrook Drive, something had changed. Carol noticed it. She told her sister years later that Harold became harder to reach after that winter, not meaner. Not distant in the way of a man who has stopped loving his family, just further away. Like there was a part of him that had gone somewhere she couldn't follow, and he was never going to invite her to go there with him. Harold Briggs was diagnosed with stage 3 colon cancer in the spring of 2018. He was 70 years old. He went through surgery and a round of chemotherapy, and then, in the way of men who have made their peace with difficult things, he began quietly putting his affairs in order. He updated his will. He organized his financial documents. He called Danny more often than usual, though he didn't say much on those calls, just asked how work was going, how Danny's daughter Reese was doing in school, whether the old truck was still running. Danny drove down to Clarksville 3 times that year, and twice in early 2019. He could see his father getting smaller, not defeated, not frightened, just quieter, like a fire burning down to coals. Harold Briggs died on a Thursday morning in September of 2019. It was quick at the end, which Carol later said she was grateful for. Danny drove down that same day, and the weeks that followed were consumed by the ordinary, terrible logistics of loss. The funeral arrangements, the calls, the meals people bring to your door, the paperwork that somehow feels obscene in its demands when you are still barely breathing. Carol moved to her sister's place in Murfreesboro in October. Danny was left to clear the house on Millbrook Drive. He took a week off work, drove back to Clarksville, and began the slow, aching process of sorting through a man's life. He spent 3 days on the house itself. On the 4th day, he started on the garage. And it was on that afternoon, a gray Tuesday, in mid-October 2019, with a light rain coming down on the roof of that old detached garage, that Danny Briggs moved a heavy steel toolbox to get better access to the workbench, and felt the floor shift under him, not dramatically, just a slight give. The kind of thing you might not notice if you weren't already moving slowly, paying attention, present in a way that grief sometimes forces you to be. He got down on his knees. He pressed his hand against the board. It moved. He found a pry bar hanging on the pegboard above the workbench. Harold had a place for everything, and he worked the board loose. And underneath it, in a hollow space no bigger than a bread box, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, secured with a bungee cord, and locked with a small padlock that had rusted nearly solid, was a metal lockbox. Danny sat on the garage floor for a while, with the box in his lap. He said later that he didn't feel excited. He didn't feel like he'd found treasure. He felt something closer to dread. He tried the padlock with a few of his father's keys from the ring hanging just inside the garage door. None of them worked. He took the box inside the house, set it on the kitchen table, and stared at it through most of that evening. The next morning, he drove it to a locksmith on Fort Campbell Boulevard, who charged him $40 and had it open in about 4 minutes. Inside the box, there were 5 things. The first was a folded newspaper, clipping small, yellowed, from the Clarksville Leaf Chronicle, labor inspector missing, last seen in Montgomery County. Dated the 18th of November, 1983. The second was a photograph, black and white, blurry, clearly taken through a window at some distance. 2 figures were visible, one of them partially turned toward the camera. The image was grainy, but the shape of a man's profile was discernible. The third was a small piece of notepaper with a name and a phone number written in handwriting that was not Harold's. At the bottom, also in this other person's hand, were the words, "Call when you're ready. I'll still be here." The fourth item was a separate envelope containing what appeared to be a photocopy of a payroll document, a single page, partially redacted, with a figure circled in blue ink. And the fifth item was a folded sheaf of 4 pages, handwritten in Harold's careful, deliberate print, the kind of handwriting a man uses when he is writing something he means to last. Danny unfolded those 4 pages and read them at the kitchen table in the house where he grew up. He read them once quickly. Then he sat for a moment. Then he read them again, slowly, the way you read something when you are hoping the second pass will somehow change what the words say. It didn't. What Harold had written was a precise, careful, almost methodical account of what he had seen on the night of the 14th of November, 1983. Every detail he could remember. The time he arrived at the plant, the name on the sign-in log, the sound of the voices, the corridor, the open door, what he saw on the floor of that office. The name of the man standing near the window, which Harold had only learned later, through a conversation he overheard in the break room the following week. The name of the man on the phone, and the name of the man who was already reaching for the light switch when Harold pulled back from the door, Warrendale Cross. Harold had written those 4 pages sometime in the last year of his life. The handwriting was shaky in places, the way handwriting gets when a man is fighting a body that is losing a war. But the facts were laid out with a kind of steadiness that suggested Harold had rehearsed them in his mind for a very long time. He had not written them as a confession. He had not written them as an apology. He had written them as a record, as if he needed someone, anyone, to know that he had seen what he had seen, that he had not imagined it, that it had been real, and that he had lived with it every day for 36 years. Danny set the pages down on the table and looked out the kitchen window for a long time. The rain was still coming down. Then he picked up the piece of notepaper with the name and the phone number. The number had a 615 area code, Middle Tennessee. He pulled out his phone. He dialed. It rang 4 times. And then a woman's voice answered. Careful. A little wary. The way a voice sounds when it has been waiting a long time for a call it was no longer sure was ever going to come. Danny said, "My name is Danny Briggs. My father was Harold Briggs. I think he knew something about your brother." And on the other end of that phone line, a 71-year-old woman named Ruth McAllister began to cry. Ruth McAllister was Philip Rudd's younger sister. She had been 9 years old when her brother went missing in 1983. And she had spent the decades since doing what the people who loved Philip Rudd were never given enough official support to do. She had kept looking. She had hired a private investigator in 1998 when she turned 35 and finally had enough money saved. She had filed requests with the Tennessee Department of Labor for records related to the Meridian Industrial Audit. She had written letters to the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office. She had contacted the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation twice. She had gotten, by her own account, not very far. The case had always been treated as a missing persons matter rather than a homicide because there had never been a body, and without a body, without physical evidence, without a witness willing to come forward, the official position had remained unchanged for 36 years. Philip Rudd was a missing person. Case open, case cold. Ruth told Danny what she had pieced together over the years. Philip had told Beverly, his wife, in the days before he disappeared, that the audit at Meridian Industrial had turned up serious problems. Not just the safety violations that had already been documented, the missing equipment guards, the inadequate chemical protection, but something worse. Philip had found, according to Beverly's recollection, evidence that Meridian Industrial had been falsifying injury and incident reports submitted to the state. Records that showed accidents that had never been reported to TOSHA, the Tennessee Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Records that, if submitted to a federal review, could have triggered a shutdown and potentially criminal liability for Holloway Timber Group and its management. Philip had called Beverly from a payphone on the afternoon of November 14th, the last confirmed contact anyone had with him. He told her he had a meeting that evening at the plant to go over his findings with the plant manager. He told her he'd be home by 9. He never came home. Beverly had reported that call to investigators in 1983. It had been noted in the initial file. And then the investigation had slowly, quietly, gone nowhere. The detective assigned to the case in 1984, a man named Lloyd Peterson from the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office, had retired in 1991. His successor had other priorities. Philip Rudd's file had been transferred to cold case status in 1996 and had not been meaningfully reviewed since. Ruth had obtained a copy of the original file through a public records request in 2009 and found it disturbingly thin. The interview with Warren Cross was 4 paragraphs long. Cross had told investigators he had met with Rudd briefly on the afternoon of November 14th to review preliminary audit findings and that Rudd had left the plant around 5 o'clock. Cross had no knowledge of Rudd's whereabouts after that. The interview had not been followed up with a second session. Cross had never been asked to provide an alibi for the full evening. Danny began pulling threads. He was not an investigator. He was a commercial HVAC technician from Nashville who had spent the past 2 weeks sorting through his dead father's belongings. But he was methodical in the way his father had been methodical, and the more he pulled, the more things unraveled. He found a lawyer in Clarksville who specialized in historical records requests and paid him to run down whatever public documents still existed from Meridian Industrial's operations in the 1980s. Some records had been destroyed. Others had been transferred to Holloway Timber Group's corporate archives when they absorbed the plant in 1989. But several sets of records, TOSHA inspection files, county permit documents, insurance filings were still publicly accessible. And in those files, consistent with what Philip Rudd had apparently discovered in 1983, there were gaps, accidents that appeared in internal insurance documents, but not in regulatory filings. Equipment replacement dates that didn't match inspection records. A pattern that a thorough auditor would absolutely have noticed and flagged. Danny also went looking for Warren Cross. And what he found there gave the story a dimension that nobody, not Danny, not Ruth, not anyone, had anticipated. Warren Cross had died in February of 2009. He had been living in Brentwood, Tennessee, a wealthy suburb of Nashville, at the time of his death. He had retired from Holloway Timber Group in 1997. After nearly 2 decades in senior management, he had been, by every outward measure, a successful man who had lived a comfortable life and died in his bed. But Warren Cross had a son. His name was Garrett. Garrett Cross was 51 years old. And as of the November 2019 election, Garrett Cross was a sitting member of the Tennessee State Legislature, representing a district in Williamson County. Danny Briggs sat with that information for almost a week before he did anything with it. He drove back to Nashville, went back to work, came home in the evenings, and sat at his kitchen table with Harold's 4 pages in front of him and tried to figure out what a man is supposed to do in this situation. He called Ruth McAllister twice during that week. He called his daughter Reese, who was 17, and the kind of clear-eyed, direct young woman who had clearly inherited nothing of Harold's silence. Reese told her father, with the blunt certainty of a teenager who has not yet learned to be afraid of the right things, "Dad, you have to do something." And Danny knew she was right. He reached out to a retired investigative journalist named Carl Weston, who had spent 30 years at a Nashville newspaper and had covered the state legislature for most of his career. Danny had been given Weston's name by the Clarksville lawyer who had helped him with the records requests. Weston agreed to meet Danny for coffee. Danny brought the box. He brought the 4 pages, the photograph, the clipping, the payroll document, and the name and phone number on the piece of notepaper. He laid it all out on the table of a diner in East Nashville on a Wednesday morning in November 2019 and watched Carl Weston read through it twice. When Weston looked up, he didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "How much of this can you verify independently?" And Danny said, "That's why I'm here." Over the next several weeks, Weston did what journalists do. He cross-referenced Harold's account against available public records. He tracked the timeline of Warren Cross's career at Holloway Timber Group against the dates in Harold's pages. He requested documents through the Tennessee Public Records Act. He contacted 2 former Meridian Industrial employees, men now in their late 60s and early 70s, who had worked at the plant in the 1980s, and spoke to them off the record. Both confirmed, without being shown Harold's account, that there had been talk at the plant in late 1983 about the safety audit. Both confirmed that after Philip Rudd disappeared, the audit had simply stopped. No follow-up inspector came. No final report was ever filed with TOSHA. The audit that Philip Rudd had been conducting for 2 weeks simply ceased to exist in the official record. Then came the piece of information that reordered everything. In December of 2004, during a highway expansion project in Robertson County, Tennessee, about 40 miles from Clarksville, construction workers operating excavating equipment had unearthed human skeletal remains. The remains were sent to the state medical examiner. They were identified through dental records in early 2005 as Philip Allen Rudd, missing since November 1983. The manner of death was listed as undetermined. The case was referred to the Robertson County Sheriff's Office, which opened an investigation. The investigation produced no arrests. The case was quietly closed 18 months later. Beverly Rudd had been notified. Ruth McAllister had been notified. Ruth had driven to the Robertson County Courthouse and demanded to know what happened. She had been told the investigation was ongoing. Then she had been told it was closed. Then she had been told there was nothing further to share. Ruth McAllister had not stopped asking questions, but nobody with any power, had started giving her answers. The payroll document in Harold's box, the photocopy with the figures circled in blue ink, was the last piece that Weston managed to partially verify. Through Holloway Timber Group's archived corporate filings, portions of which had been released as part of a 1,999 OSHA compliance audit of a different facility, Weston found references to a discretionary budget line maintained at the Meridian plant under Warren Cross's authority. The figures circled on Harold's document matched, within a plausible range, an outflow from that discretionary line recorded in January of 1984. There was no direct smoking gun. There was no signed receipt. There was no confession from a man who was now 15 years dead. But taken together, Harold's written account, the timeline, the audit that vanished, Philip Rudd's remains found 40 miles from the plant, the raise that arrived 1 month after Harold stayed silent, and the career trajectory of a plant manager who had every reason to keep a witness quiet, the picture that emerged was damning enough that Carl Weston said, quietly, over a second cup of coffee, that if he were still a working journalist, this would be a front-page story. Danny contacted Ruth McAllister again. He drove to Murfreesboro to meet her in person, not where Carol was staying, but at a coffee shop near the university, where Ruth arrived 20 minutes early and sat by the window watching the parking lot the way a woman watches for something when she has been watching for a very long time. Danny brought copies of everything. He laid it out in front of her. He did not editorialize. He just showed her what his father had written, what Carl Weston had verified, and what it all appeared to mean. Ruth McAllister read Harold's 4 pages in complete silence. When she finished, she folded them carefully, smoothed the creases, and set them on the table in front of her. And then she looked at Danny Briggs and said something that Danny would carry for the rest of his life. She said, "He saw. All these years, I knew someone had to have seen. I just never thought I'd find out who." In February of 2020, Danny Briggs, with the support of Ruth McAllister and Carl Weston, submitted a formal written complaint to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, along with copies of all documentary evidence, Harold's handwritten account, the photograph, the newspaper clipping, the payroll document, and Weston's independently compiled research summary. The complaint requested a formal review of the 2005 closure of the Philip Rudd homicide investigation in light of newly discovered witness testimony. As of the time this story is being told, the TBI has acknowledged receipt of the complaint and confirmed it is under review. No formal charges have been filed. Garrett Cross has made no public statement. His office, when contacted by a journalist working on a separate story about cold cases in Tennessee, declined to comment. Beverly Rudd, Philip's wife, passed away in 2016. She never learned what happened to her husband. Marcus Rudd, Philip's son, was contacted by Ruth McAllister after Danny came forward. He is now in his early 50s. He lives in Memphis. Ruth told Danny that when she called Marcus to tell him about Harold's account, he went quiet for a long time. Then he said, "So, it was real. We always knew it was real. We just couldn't prove it." Carol Briggs, Harold's wife, was told about the box and its contents by Danny in December of 2019. Danny drove to Murfreesboro, sat down with his mother at the kitchen table, and read her Harold's 4 pages out loud. Carol listened without speaking. When Danny finished, she sat for a long time looking at her hands. Then she said, "He tried to tell me once, about a year after we were married. He started to say something, and then he stopped and said, 'Never mind. I never pushed him.'" She paused. "Maybe I should have." Danny Briggs went back to work in Nashville. He went back to his apartment, his daughter, his routines. But he did one thing differently. He told Reese everything. He sat her down, his 17-year-old daughter, who had her grandfather's eyes and her grandmother's warmth and almost none of Harold's silence, and he told her the whole story. Who Harold was, what Harold saw, what Harold did, what Harold kept, why Danny had done what he did. Reese listened carefully, the way she always did when something mattered. And when Danny finished, she said, "Grandpa was scared." And then she said, "But he kept the box," which means he never stopped wanting someone to know. Danny nodded. And he thought about that for a long time. He still does. There is a version of Harold Briggs that is easy to condemn. A man who witnessed what appears to have been a murder, who accepted what appears to have been a payment for his silence, who went home to his family and his biscuits and his Sunday mornings and let a dead man stay buried for 36 years. That version is real. Harold did those things. He made those choices. He lived with them, and he took them to the edge of his grave. But there is another version of Harold Briggs that is harder to dismiss. A man who, in the months before he died, sat down with a trembling hand and wrote 4 careful pages that he knew would outlast him, who preserved a photograph that should not have survived, who kept a number that belonged to a grieving sister who had never given up, who could have thrown everything away, who could have taken the secret all the way down, and chose instead to leave a door open for the truth. Whether that was courage or guilt or something in between is a question Danny Briggs cannot fully answer, and maybe it doesn't need one answer. Maybe both things can be true about a man at the same time. What Harold Briggs saw on the night of the 14th of November 1983 did not belong to him. It belonged to Philip Rudd's wife, who spent the rest of her life not knowing. It belonged to Philip Rudd's children, who grew up without a father and without the truth. It belonged to Ruth McAllister, who spent 40 years asking questions in empty rooms. It belonged to justice, which does not expire just because enough time has passed and enough powerful people have moved on. Harold understood that. That is why he kept the box. That is why the box was not empty when Danny found it. And that is why, on a gray Tuesday afternoon in October 2019, a middle-aged man from Nashville sat on a garage floor holding a piece of his father he had never been allowed to see, and understood, maybe for the first time, that the quiet man he had grown up trying to read had been trying, in his own broken and insufficient and ultimately irreplaceable way, to be read. Harold Briggs never told his son what he saw that night, but he told the truth eventually, in the only way he knew how, in the only time he felt he could, in the only form that felt safe enough to leave behind. And Danny Briggs did what sons do when they finally understand their fathers. He carried it forward. Now I want to hear from you. If you were Danny Briggs, sitting on that garage floor, with that box in your hands, what would you have done? Would you have submitted that complaint? Would you have made that call? Or would you have closed the box, put it back under the floor, and walked away? Drop your answer in the comments, because I genuinely want to know where you land. These stories only mean something if we are willing to sit inside them together. And if you are watching this and you are thinking about the quiet men in your own life, the fathers, the uncles, the grandfathers who never said much, who carried things you could see but never name, maybe ask yourself what they might have left behind. Not in garages necessarily, but somewhere, because the people who love us rarely take everything with them. They just make us do the work of finding it. Before we go, please hit that subscribe button if you have not already. Every single week, we bring you a new story from the places where family, silence, and the truth collide. You do not want to miss what is coming next. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, because some stories are too important to watch alone.